The trial of 4 men accused of murdering former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri has begun in The Hague. The 4 are being tried in absentia. The UN warns that bloodshed in the Central African Republic could turn into genocide. Violence has continued despite the resignation last week of President Michel Djotodia. And Ukraine's opposition leaders rally supporters in Kiev after a law is passed to prevent anti-government protests. Hello, you're watching France 24. I'm Karen Roberts. Good to have you with us. 4 Hezbollah members went on trial in absentia at a special UN tribunal on Thursday. They're accused of murdering Lebanon's former premier Rafik Hariri in a 2005 car bombing as sectarian tensions ran high in the country. Lebanese people at home are still highly polarised over Hariri's murder. Julia Seeger has more.
The sign reads, "Time for Justice." On Thursday, dozens of supporters of former Prime Minister Rafik Hariri unveiled a giant poster in Beirut, just meters away from the site where he was killed. A timer has been mounted on the billboard to keep track of how long the trial will last.
If they tackle it from the roots, the truth will be revealed. But if they start to take opinions from here and there, then the International Tribunal will be lost.
Hariri's murder has polarized Lebanese society. Many now see the tribunal as an opportunity to expose those behind the blast in 2005, which also killed several other political leaders. But all 4 suspects are believed to be linked to the Hezbollah movement, causing others to accuse the International Tribunal of being highly politicized and aimed at undermining Israel's opponents. A view voiced many times before by the Shia movement's leader.
This investigation, this tribunal, its decisions, and what could come out of it is clearly an American-Israeli plot. We refuse it, and we refuse whatever comes out of it.
Many in Lebanon fear the tribunal will fuel fresh sectarian violence. Hariri's death had already increased tensions between Sunnis and Shiites. Tensions that have reached new highs as the Syrian conflict spills over into its Mediterranean neighbor.
Meanwhile, a suicide bomb in northern Lebanon has killed 3 people and wounded 47. The blast happened in the town of Hermel, a Hezbollah stronghold in Bekaa province. The jihadist al-Nusra Front in Lebanon has claimed responsibility for the attack. It said it was taking revenge on Hezbollah for its support of the Assad regime in Syria. 2 weeks of battles between Syrian rebels and jihadists have killed at least 1,069 people. That's according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Most of those who were killed were fighters. The battles broke out when rebels launched an offensive mainly in northern Syria against their former jihadist allies. Navi Pillay, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, had this to say.
In the past 2 weeks, we have received reports of a succession of mass executions of civilians and ex-fighters who were no longer participating in hostilities in Aleppo, Idlib and Raqqa by hardline armed opposition groups in Syria, in particular the group known as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS.
And on the eve of a key meeting, US Secretary of State John Kerry has urged the divided Syrian opposition to join peace talks aimed at installing a new government. The Syrian opposition has yet to agree to sit down with members of the regime of President Assad to chart a path to end the war. John Kerry stressed the importance of getting everyone to the table at next week's Geneva II.
The world needs no reminder that Syria has become the magnet for jihadists and extremists. It is the strongest magnet for terror of any place today. So it defies logic to imagine that those whose brutality created this magnet, how they could ever lead Syria away from extremism and towards a better future is beyond any kind of logic or common sense.
In a related development, the effort to rid Syria of its chemical weapons stockpile, the UN watchdog says the most lethal chemicals will be destroyed by the end of June, not March as planned. Syria agreed to destroy its entire chemical weapons stockpile under international pressure in September. Kate Moody has the story.
the busy Italian port of Gioia Tauro will be getting some more dangerous cargo. It's been selected as a transfer point for the international process of removing and destroying Syria's chemical agents. The operation has already begun but has been delayed by bad weather, bureaucracy, and the ongoing conflict. All the chemicals were supposed to have been removed from Syria by the end of December, but the head of the UN's chemical weapons watchdog says only 16 of the total 560 tons of chemicals have so far left the country.
We had some practical problems, but everything was, realized in one day, beginning with the from the storage site to Latakia and loading onto the ship. I think based on this trial, we would be able to, in fact, to move quicker in the coming weeks.
The chemical agents, which include mustard gas and the components for sarin and VX, will be loaded onto a Danish ship in the Syrian city of Latakia. At Gioia Tauro, they'll be transferred onto an American vessel, which will carry on to international waters and safely destroy them. Warships from China, Russia, Denmark and Norway will provide security throughout the operation. Italian authorities insist none of the chemical materials will be brought to shore, but the decision has sparked protests, with Gioia Tauro's mayor saying his town isn't equipped for such a transfer.
Iraqi forces have attacked a militant stronghold in Anbar province, while authorities found 14 bullet-riddled bodies there. The latest fighting comes amid fears the country is sliding back into the worst of the brutal Sunni-Shiite conflict, which killed tens of thousands in 2006 and 2007. UN Chief Ban Ki-moon and other diplomats have urged Baghdad to pursue political reconciliation to end the standoff in Anbar and the surge in violence there. As sporadic violence continues in the Central African Republic, a senior UN official has warned the bloodshed could turn into genocide if the international community doesn't do more to stop the killings between Muslim and Christian communities. Sectarian violence has plagued the country since mostly Muslim Seleka rebels ousted the former Christian president last March. Claire Williams has the story.
In trucks packed with their worldly possessions, these Chadians flee Bangui. Escorted by African peacekeeping forces, they speed through a Christian neighbourhood. Locals line the roadside, accusing the refugees of having links to the Seleka and shouting at them to go home. Sectarian violence has gripped the Central African Republic since mostly Muslim Seleka rebels, some recruited from Chad, ousted Christian President François Bozizé last March, installing Muslim Michel Djotodia in his place. The Seleka looted and killed civilians. That sparked revenge attacks from so-called anti-Balaka Christian militia. Now a senior United Nations official says there's a real risk of genocide.
It has all the elements that we have seen elsewhere. In places like Rwanda and Bosnia, the elements are there, the seeds are there for a genocide. There's no question about that.
Saying the country is almost a failed state, France's UN ambassador called on the international community to help stop the violence.
Because in a sense, the Central African state has collapsed. Really, and everything has been destroyed. The Seleka, they have burned the archives, they have burned the registries, they have plundered. And plundering doesn't mean taking the computer, it's taking the windows, the tiles, everything.
Djotodia resigned last week. The head of the National Transition Council is currently interim president. By the end of next week, the council will elect a new leader, whose job it will be to organise national elections planned next year.
To Ukraine, where opposition leaders rallied supporters in Kiev's central Independence Square late on Thursday. Hours earlier, President Viktor Yanukovych's party of the regions passed a law in an attempt to curb anti-government protests. The law said unauthorized tents, stages or amplifiers in public places in Ukraine would be punished by a fine or detention. Hala Mohidan has the story.
Braving the cold once again for what could be their last night in Kiev's Independence Square. Ukraine's pro-Europe demonstrators suffered a major setback today when Yanukovych's ruling party blindsided the opposition and pushed through a new law attempting to curb the anti-government protests. voted on by an unorthodox show of hands. The controversial law punishes unsanctioned protests in public places with a fine or up to 15 days detention. Amidst chaotic scenes as lawmakers clashed over a number of proposals making their way through Parliament, the opposition denounced this move as an illegitimate power grab and refused to recognise it.
All the laws were passed in violation of parliamentary procedure and therefore have no legal force.
Outside the Parliament, however, a show of support for Yanukovych's government, with protesters here keen to underline that their president has a legitimate mandate.
This government was elected fairly. You can't elect power through protests.
We support our president and want to show that there are other points of view from those in Independence Square.
But in Independence Square, the anti-government protesters remain unmoved. For many, the threat of this new law still isn't enough to scare them off.
I'm not afraid of anything because this law is illegitimate. That's why we don't have to be afraid, and we'll keep fighting until we win, until we remove Yanukovych and his gangsters.
The law doesn't come into effect until it's signed by President Yanukovych. Until then, the stalemate continues.
Some news in brief now. In Thailand, an anti-corruption agency is to investigate a rice subsidy programme used to help the Prime Minister's party gain power. The news has further fuelled opposition to Yingluck Shinawatra. The unrest flared in November and escalated this week when demonstrators occupied parts of Bangkok, demanding that Yingluck resign. Officials from the Vatican are facing tough questions from a UN committee over the sexual abuse of children by Catholic priests. The Catholic Church has faced a slew of allegations of child sex abuse by priests around the world and criticism over inadequate responses from church officials. And pollution levels in China's capital hit more than 25 times recommended levels on Thursday. It's the worst level in months. Beijing is one of the world's most polluted capitals, with smog regularly hitting dangerous levels. The nominations for the Oscars have been announced, with the space-age drama Gravity and the FBI caper American Hustle head-to-head with 10 nominations apiece. The Academy Awards will be presented on March the 2nd in Los Angeles.
Slavery, space, and Somali pirates. Just some of the themes in the running for this year's Oscar for Best Film.
The Best Picture nominees for 2013 are American Hustle, Captain Phillips, Dallas Buyers Club, Gravity, Her, Nebraska, Philomena, 12 Years a Slave, and The Wolf of Wall Street.
The Academy announced all of the nominations in Los Angeles early on Thursday morning. The most hotly tipped films of the bunch, American Hustle and Gravity, with 10 nominations each. Their directors, David O. Russell and Alfonso Cuarón, have both received the Best Director nod, where they'll be in competition with Alexander Payne, Steve McQueen and Martin Scorsese. McQueen gave his starring role to Chiwetel Ejiofor in 12 Years a Slave, a performance that's already garnered praise from the critics.
Runaway. I was a free man. I'm not a slave.
It'll be a hard-run race for him against Matthew McConaughey's portrayal of an HIV-positive redneck in Dallas Buyers Club. The Best Actress category was a list of some of the industry's major players. Sandra Bullock, Judi Dench and Meryl Streep are all previous Oscar winners, looking to add another Academy Award to their collection. Oscar hopes in France were dashed when it came to the Best Foreign Picture. Abdelatif Kechiche's love story, Blue is the Warmest Colour, was not eligible for an Academy Award nomination since it was released after the September deadline in its home country.
That's it. More news coming up. Do stay with us here on France 24.